The wind howled through white pines, rattling the bare trees like skeletons clashing in the night. Snow swept through the town in thick, blinding waves, burying rooftops and erasing roads beneath its icy grip. Temperatures had plummeted far below freezing, turning every breath into a ghostly mist. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, and anyone caught in the storm wouldn't last long. Nature was ruthless tonight, and something was fighting against it. Jake clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. The road ahead was barely visible, swallowed by the swirling snow. The old truck's heater whined, barely keeping the cold at bay. His breath fogged up the windshield as he exhaled, exhaustion creeping in. Another night, another storm, another drive back to an empty cabin. It was just him and the cold, until something in the distance shattered his quiet routine. At the edge of the bridge, movement caught his eye. A dark shape writhing against the relentless white. Jake's pulse spiked. Half submerged in the icy river below, a figure thrashed desperately, struggling to hold on. A deer? A person? No. As he slowed the truck, the figure flailed once more, a splash sending shards of ice scattering into the current. Jake's heart pounded against his ribs. Whatever it was alive. But not for much longer. His foot hovered over the brake. His mind screamed, "It's too dangerous." The river was nearly frozen over, and the storm had turned the banks into treacherous sheets of ice. One wrong step, and he could end up in that water too. He swallowed hard. What could he even do? The wind cut through the cracks of his truck, whispering cold doubts in his ears. Leave it, it's not your problem. But deep down, he knew. He'd never be able to live with himself if he drove away. Training overpowered fear. His body moved before his mind could protest. Jake slammed the truck into park, his boots hitting the snow-covered ground with a crunch. The cold punched through his jacket, but he didn't stop. Years in the military had taught him that hesitation was the difference between life and death. This wasn't just some accident, this was a rescue. His legs carried him through the snowdrifts, toward the riverbank, toward the unknown. As he neared the river, the shape came into focus. A German shepherd, barely holding on to the jagged ice. Ice clung to its fur, its ears pinned back in terror. Its eyes locked onto Jake's, wide and pleading. The current pulled against it, threatening to drag it under. It wasn't just fighting the cold, it was fighting for its life. And Jake was the only one who could stop it from losing. Jake had no time to think, only to act. The river's surface was treacherous, but hesitation would mean death. He ripped off his jacket, braced himself, and stepped forward. The cold bit at his skin, but he didn't stop. One foot forward, then another. The dog whimpered, claws scraping against the ice. A second longer, and it would slip away. He inhaled sharply, then lunged, hands reaching into the freezing abyss, grasping for something. Anything. Tonight, one life would change forever. Jake's boots crunched through the brittle ice, each step a gamble as he pushed forward. The wind howled around him, stinging his exposed skin, but his focus was locked on the dark shape thrashing in the freezing river. The dog clawed at the jagged ice, its paws slipping, its frantic splashes growing weaker. Jake waded deeper, his breath hitching as the numbing cold seeped through his clothes. The shepherd let out a strangled whimper, its strength failing. Jake knew. He had only moments before it was too late. The dog's desperate paddling slowed. Its body sank for a second before resurfacing, but just barely. Jake's chest tightened. The shepherd's head bobbed, its muzzle barely above the waterline. Another moment, and it would disappear beneath the icy surface for good. Jake's muscles tensed. He forced himself forward, ice cracking beneath his weight. The river's current pulled at the dog, dragging it farther from safety. The shepherd let out one final, exhausted gasp before slipping under. Jake's heart pounded. No hesitation now. He lunged. Cold shock gripped his body, but Jake shoved the pain aside. Training took over. He reached deep into the water, fingers closing around wet fur. With a sharp pull, he yanked the shepherd upward. The dog's lifeless form broke the surface, coughing weakly. Jake hoisted him onto the ice, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His muscles screamed from exertion, but he pushed forward, dragging the shivering dog onto solid ground. Every second counted. If he didn't get the shepherd warm soon, the cold would claim them both. Jake wrapped his jacket around the trembling animal, his hands brushing against something rough. His eyes flickered to the dog's ear, a jagged scar, deep and old. This wasn't just any stray. The mark told a story of hardship, of survival. The shepherd whimpered softly, curling against the warmth of Jake's chest. For the first time, their eyes met, not just with fear, but something else. A silent plea, a quiet trust. Jake tightened his hold on the shepherd, bracing against the howling wind. He staggered back toward the truck, his legs screaming in protest as the storm intensified. Snow whipped around him, turning the world into a white blur. He pushed forward, shielding the dog as best he could. The shepherd shuddered violently in his arms, its breath coming in short, weak pants. "Hang in there, buddy," Jake muttered through clenched teeth, his own breath ragged. The truck was close. Just a few more steps. He had to move faster. If the cold settled too deep, neither of them would make it. The truck's engine roared to life, the heater blasting full force. Jake reached over, pulling the shepherd closer. Its fur was damp, ice clinging to the thick coat. Jake exhaled sharply. The dog barely stirred. "You're all right now," he murmured, keeping one eye on the road. The shepherd curled into a tight ball, the rhythmic rise and fall of its chest barely visible under the flickering dashboard light. Jake swallowed hard. Whoever this dog was, whatever it had been through, one thing was certain. Tonight, it had come terrifyingly close to death. Jake reached over, his fingers brushing against the worn-out leather collar around the shepherd's neck. No tag, no name, just a faded strip of material that had once held an identity. His grip tightened. Someone had owned this dog once. Someone had cared. So how had it ended up out here, abandoned in a death trap? The shepherd let out a faint sigh, pressing closer to the warmth of the heater. Jake glanced at him, his mind turning over a single thought. Whoever had let this dog go, they didn't deserve him. A soft whimper broke the silence. Jake looked over. The shepherd's glassy eyes met his exhaustion, clouding their golden depths. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, the dog shifted, just enough to rest his head against Jake's leg. Jake swallowed, an unexpected tightness forming in his chest. That tiny movement, that quiet touch, it was trust. Fragile, hesitant, but there. Jake exhaled, reaching down to run his fingers through the damp fur. "You're safe now, boy," he murmured. For the first time, the shepherd closed his eyes and rested. Jake crouched beside the shepherd, setting a steaming bowl of broth on the floor. The rich scent of chicken and herbs filled the small cabin, but the dog only sniffed at it, his weary eyes barely open. His ribs were too visible beneath his wet fur, yet exhaustion kept him from eating. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe now." The shepherd shivered but didn't move, his breathing slow and labored. Jake grabbed an old blanket and draped it over him, his chest tightening. This dog had been through hell. The next morning, Jake found the shepherd limping behind him as he moved through the house. Whether he went to the kitchen, the living room, or back to the fireplace, the dog trailed him with quiet determination. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't like being alone, do you?" He knelt down, watching as the dog sat at his feet, his amber eyes steady. "Shadow, that's what I'll call you." Shadow's ears twitched, as if acknowledging the name. Even in his pain, even after everything he had endured, the dog refused to leave his side. For the first time in a long while, Jake didn't feel so alone either. Later that evening, as Shadow dozed by the fire, Jake found himself staring at the faint scars on the dog's ear. His fingers clenched involuntarily. Memories surged. Another dog, another war zone. Maximum. Jake swallowed hard, closing his eyes. His canine partner had been more than just a dog, he had been family. But war didn't spare anyone, not even the best of them. When Max had fallen, Jake had sworn he'd never let himself get attached again. Yet here he was, tending to another wounded soldier. He glanced at Shadow, who twitched in his sleep, as if chasing something in a dream. Maybe they were both running from the past. Maybe they could heal together. Over the next few days, Jake noticed the signs. Every loud noise, a dropped pan, the wind slamming against the windows, made Shadow flinch. He cowered at sudden movements, his body tensing like he expected a blow. And he wouldn't eat unless Jake was in the room. Jake sat beside him one evening, offering another bowl of food. "Who hurt you, boy?" His voice was soft, but Shadow only stared at the food, waiting. Jake sighed, settling in. "All right, I'll wait too." Minutes passed before Shadow finally, hesitantly, started to eat. Jake knew then, this wasn't just about healing a body. Shadow carried wounds far deeper than the ones on his skin. Jake woke with a jolt to the sound of frantic barking. His heart pounded as he shot upright. Shadow was at the bedroom door, ears pinned back, barking in sharp, urgent bursts. "Shadow, what?" Jake stopped. Smoke. The acrid scent burned his nose as he swung his legs out of bed. His eyes darted toward the living room, the chimney. He sprinted forward, yanking open the stove's iron door. Thick black smoke billowed out. The chimney was clogged, if he hadn't woken up. Jake turned to Shadow, who stood there, panting, eyes still locked on the danger. Jake exhaled, kneeling. "You just saved my life, boy." Shadow lowered his head, pressing it lightly against Jake's knee. For the first time, the dog had reached for him first. The next evening, Jake sat on the floor beside Shadow, fire crackling softly nearby. "You know," he muttered, "I don't say it much, but I owe you one." Shadow glanced at him, those sharp amber eyes studying him like they understood more than they should. Jake hesitated, then slowly reached out, scratching behind the shepherd's scarred ear. For a moment Shadow stiffened, but then something shifted. He leaned into Jake's hand, just slightly, but it was enough. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen battle-hardened men take longer to trust than this dog had. "Yeah," he whispered, giving the shepherd another scratch. "We'll figure this out together." And for the first time since he found him, Shadow let out a quiet sigh and rested his head against Jake's leg. As the days passed, Jake started training Shadow. Basic commands at first. Sit. Instant obedience. Stay. Not even a twitch. Something about it felt too precise, too disciplined. One evening, as he dried Shadow off from a light snowfall, his fingers brushed against the worn leather of his collar. No tag, no name, just an old, faded imprint where something had once been. Jake frowned. "Who trained you, boy?" Shadow looked up, silent. A military-trained dog. Abandoned, scarred. Jake's gut tightened. Has someone been looking for him? Or had someone deliberately left him behind? Either way, Jake wasn't about to let him go. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and fur. Jake held Shadow's leash as the vet scanned for a microchip, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. The device beeped, and the vet's eyes narrowed. "That's strange," she muttered. Jake leaned forward. "What?" The screen flashed. Restricted contact. Classified access only. A chill ran through Jake's spine. "What does that mean?" The vet hesitated. I don't know. I've never seen this before." Jake glanced at Shadow. The dog sat still, his ears perked, sensing something was off. A restricted microchip. What had Shadow been through? And who was looking for him? That night, Jake sat on his porch, staring into the darkened woods beyond his cabin. The wind whispered through the trees, but something felt off. His gut twisted as he spotted it. A car parked just beyond the tree line. Its headlights were off, but he could see the faint glow of a lit cigarette inside. Someone was watching. Shadow let out a low growl, his body rigid. Jake's pulse quickened. Has someone traced the microchip? He grabbed his rifle, keeping it close. The car lingered for another few minutes, then, as if realizing they'd been noticed, it slowly backed up and disappeared into the night. Jake wasn't imagining this. Someone was coming for Shadow. The next morning, Shadow's growl was the first thing Jake heard. He bolted upright to find the dog standing by the window, his hackles raised. His amber eyes were locked onto the tree line. "What is it, boy?" Jake grabbed his binoculars and scanned the woods. His stomach clenched. There. A figure in dark clothing, lurking between the trees. Watching. Shadow barked, sharp and warning. The figure didn't move at first, then, after a moment, they vanished deeper into the forest. Jake clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. He needed to figure out who Shadow really was, before it was too late. Jake spent hours searching online. Military dog thefts, illegal sales, underground rings. His gut told him Shadow was tied to something bigger. Then he found it. A news report about stolen K9S dogs taken from service, erased from records, and sold to the highest bidder. Jake exhaled sharply. Shadow wasn't just any stray, he'd been taken. His hands tightened into fists. Who had done this? Has Shadow been mistreated? He looked down at the sleeping dog curled by the fire, scars lining his body, flinching at every sudden noise. Someone had tried to break him. But Shadow had fought to survive. And Jake wasn't about to let them take him again. The knock came late that evening, firm, purposeful. Jake opened the door cautiously. 2 men stood on his porch, suits too crisp, smiles too forced. "We're looking for our dog," one said, voice smooth. "We believe you have him." Jake stiffened. Shadow, behind him, let out a deep, menacing growl. The second man chuckled, glancing at Shadow. "Looks like he remembers us." Shadow's body trembled, but it wasn't fear. It was rage. His lip curled, revealing sharp teeth. Jake's heart pounded. These weren't owners. They were the ones who had stolen him. And now, they wanted him back. "You've got the wrong dog," Jake said, stepping forward. The first man's eyes darkened. "We don't think so." They moved closer. Shadow barked, stepping protectively in front of Jake. The men hesitated. "I don't know who you are," Jake said, voice steady, "but this dog isn't going anywhere." The taller man's jaw tightened. "You don't understand," Jake cut him off. You don't understand." His grip tightened on the shotgun, leaning against the doorframe. "Leave. Now." A tense silence. Then the men exchanged a glance, smirking as they backed away. "This isn't over," one murmured. Jake shut the door. He knew they'd be back. The sound of shattering glass jolted Jake awake. He sprang up, then heard Shadow snarl. Two figures had slipped through the back window. They moved quickly, but Shadow was faster. With a vicious bark, he launched himself at the nearest intruder, his teeth sinking into the man's arm. The second man lunged for Jake, but Jake swung hard, knocking him back. The first man screamed, struggling against Shadow's grip. For the first time since Jake found him, Shadow wasn't cowering. He was fighting back. Jake's heart swelled with pride. The dog they had broken had learned to stand his ground. Tires screeched as the men fled into the night. Jake grabbed his phone, dialing the sheriff. "I have an emergency, home invasion, and I have names." Shadow planted beside him, blood on his fur, but none of it was his own. As sirens wailed in the distance, Jake knelt beside him. He ran a hand through Shadow's coat, his voice soft. "You did good, buddy." Shadow leaned into his touch. For the first time, there was no fear in his eyes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Shadow had a home now, and Jake would make damn sure no one ever took him again. Jake sat across from the investigator, his hands clenched into fists. The officer slid a file across the table. "You were right," he said. "Shadow wasn't a stray. He was stolen." Jake's stomach tightened. He glanced at the papers, scanning through reports of missing military dogs, illegal sales, and cruel training regimens. Shadow had been ripped from his unit, torn from the handlers who had once depended on him. The weight of the revelation settled in Jake's chest. No wonder Shadow had scars, both visible and unseen. He reached down, ruffling the dog's fur. "You've been through hell, buddy," he murmured. "But you're home now." The investigator cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said. "Given the circumstances, the military is allowing select individuals to legally adopt recovered dogs. If you want, Shadow could stay with you." Jake's breath caught. Stay with him? The thought sent a rush of emotions crashing through him. Shadow, sensing something, nudged Jake's hand with his nose. His amber eyes held the same question. Jake swallowed hard. He had never planned on keeping Shadow forever, but the idea of letting him go now, it felt impossible. "You're saying he could be mine?" Jake asked, voice tight. "Permanently," the officer confirmed. Jake's fingers tightened around the adoption papers. His heart pounded in his chest. For years, he had avoided attachments, convinced that everyone left eventually. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a friend, a protector, a piece of something Jake hadn't realized he was missing. But what if something happened to him? What if Shadow disappeared like everyone else? Shadow whined softly, pressing his head into Jake's lap, as if sensing his hesitation. Jake exhaled slowly. Maybe, just this once, he could take the risk. Jake gripped the pen and signed his name. The ink barely dried before Shadow nudged his arm again, tail wagging. Jake laughed, shaking his head. All right, he muttered. "You win, buddy." The papers were official. Shadow was his. As they stepped outside, a crisp breeze rustled through the trees. For the first time in years, Jake felt steady, whole. He looked down at Shadow, who met his gaze with unwavering trust. "Looks like we're stuck with each other now," Jake said, smiling. Shadow barked once, as if in agreement. Weeks passed, and the scars of Shadow's past faded into the background. Together, they ran through the woods at dawn, trained in the afternoons, and sat in peaceful silence under the stars at night. Shadow was more than just a pet. He was family. One evening, as Jake watched Shadow chase a falling leaf, a thought settled deep in his chest. He hadn't just rescued Shadow. Shadow had rescued him too. With a final glance at his loyal companion, Jake whispered, We're exactly where we're meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. Jake sat on the porch, watching Shadow doze at his feet, his chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. He had always thought loyalty was given freely, but he now understood. It was something earned. Through every hardship, every moment of doubt, Shadow had stayed, not because he had to, but because he trusted Jake. That trust had been built on patience, kindness, and shared struggles. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Shadow wasn't the only one who had been lost. Jake had spent years wandering through life, avoiding connections, pushing people away. But in Shadow, he had found something he never expected: redemption. A second chance at something deeper, something real. They had saved each other in ways no one else ever could. Jake had thought he was just helping astray. Instead, Shadow had given him purpose. The weight of loneliness that had clung to him for years had lifted, replaced by an unbreakable bond. In saving Shadow, he had saved himself. And as they walked side by side, Jake knew this was home.